Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. It is exactly 8:34 a.m. News and views on Salam Media, and always a pleasure, always a pleasure talking with you, dear brother Ashraf Patel. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the program, and how are you doing?
Wa alaikum salam, Julian listeners. Hope you all well on a cold day.
Alhamdulillah. With your duas, Alhamdulillah. Ashraf Patel, I know you, but possibly a lot of the listeners don't know who you are. So let's do an introduction. Ashraf Patel is the Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue. And we are going to be talking about things that are happening between a couple of countries, Middle East being at the center of everything. They are saying goodbye to America and hello, China. How does this bode for the rest of the world? Let's kick off firstly by asking you, Ashraf. There are major tectonic shifts in geopolitics in a post COVID world, and especially in the current Ukraine conflict. Please unpack for us.
Yes, Julie. The world is undergoing a structural geopolitical change and several very heated conflicts. So the Ukraine war is one of the markers of this decade and can change the trajectory of international relations. Just as, let's say, the Iraq war of 1990
Mm.
changed the global trajectory at that point in time 30 years ago. So it's quite significant. And what's happening is the superpowers, the UN five, meaning the US, Britain, France, that constitutes the West, and then you have Russia and China that constitutes the East. Now, these members are the core of the UN Security Council and the most powerful nations on the planet. And they're engaging in a series of very competitive kind of politics and economics globally. So the Ukraine war is an example, and many other conflicts, especially on the African continent. But more important, with the rise of China in the post-COVID world, we've seen a new dimension. So it's not the old kind of Cold War conflict
Mm.
between the US and USSR, where there were lots of military kind of action across the world. With this conflict with China, the domain is going to be in the area of economics, in trade, in infrastructure, and which of the power blocks can give the world a better deal. And I think already we can see China is ahead of the race purely because over the last 3 decades, it has managed to master the globalization game, especially international trade. So it has an advantage at this point in time.
So, what you're saying is that China is the development and trade superpower, very especially with the Belt and Road Initiative. But let's look at the global and regional engagement of China as well.
Yes, quite correct. So in the last decade, remember during the 1990s and 2000s, China was the kind of factory of the world. And as a result, it produced everything that global consumers around the world enjoyed during those golden years of the 90s and 2000s.
Mm.
And with that surplus, which is at $2.9 trillion, it has developed its own industry. So China is leapfrogged in every major technology. So if you look at, let's say, 4G and 5G technologies, Huawei is a global leader. I just read in the news this week that as of the second quarter of this year, China is now the world's largest auto exporter. It has
Mm.
passed the US and Germany at 10.8 million vehicles. And you can see the quality of the motor vehicles and auto industry now even matches the quality of, let's say, German or
Mhm.
Swedish vehicles at almost 40% less of the cost. In this way, China is winning the hearts and minds of global nations with a kind of more affordable deal and a better kind of quality of life, but without the kind of high interest rates that comes with development loans. So these are all the kind of dynamics that is playing itself out. And you refer to the Belt and Road Initiative,
Mm-hmm.
that being the largest infrastructure development program in the world, that straddles the whole Eurasian region,
Mm-hmm.
most of the South Asia, as well as circling Africa into Latin America. So it's a major connectivity infrastructure program. And they have the money for it. They don't have to go to any international institution to fund it. So this makes it a unique proposition for Middle East countries that need to rebuild after many wars.
So no trade-offs there. Ashraf, let's go to the Middle East. We know that they've been the strategic center of U.S. foreign policy for decades. This has been waning now. Why? And obviously, they still intent on having that huge presence in the Middle East, but it's definitely waning.
Yes, definitely. Remember, if we were to look at history, when Lawrence of Arabia entered the peninsula in 1880 with
Mm,
the discovery of gold, it was then at that point the Al Saud family took power. So about 120 years ago or so. And that cemented a strategic partnership between the West and the Saud family. And that has persisted throughout the decades. And in post World War II, under the Roosevelt administration and the Al Saud family, this kind of relationship deepened to a level where during the Cold War, particularly nations like Saudi Arabia and Turkey under Ataturk, and was one of the strategic centers in that battle of the Cold War. So it was strategic for political reasons, but also for access to energy and oil. But in
we
the last decade, with the climate change crisis and the move
mm,
towards renewable, the so-called the middle that proposition is no more as strong as it was before. The U.S. has also in the last decade become fairly self-sufficient in oil.
mhm.
Therefore, the Middle East is being ditched by the U.S. And in this vacuum comes in China, that at the right time has the kind of partnership model that the Middle East nations like, meaning that China does not tell them what to do
Right.
in terms of a whole range of issues, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a better proposition for Middle East leaders, be it Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, etc. And China has now moved in this gap and moved very decisively with the visit of President Xi in March to Saudi Arabia. And that was seen as a strategic investment, trade, as well as political discussions were held.
We know that the United States have requested that Saudi Arabia drops the oil price, but they're hearing nothing of it. I should imagine simply because they've now, uh, uh, you know, cemented ties with China, and we also know that Xi Jinping has visited them recently. So that does say a lot. But let's look at the ties now that seem to be strengthening between Saudi Arabia and Iran. What is that saying to the rest of the Middle East and to the world? Because in the past, the West were very, very happy with this cold non-relationship between the rest of the Middle East and everyone being anti-Iran. Things are shifting and they're shifting pretty rapidly. What do we see in this relationship now? What are we going to be seeing?
Yes, that is another example of the more responsible role of China as an emerging superpower. It, it has brought together the two rivals, Iran and Saudi Arabia. And remember, there was a very kind of hot war that was fought in Yemen, the poorest nation on the planet. And
Mm,
that war just didn't make any sense to anybody. And it has been the most catastrophic conflict in the last decade. So, in this vacuum, China moved in with a peace proposal and process that was warmly received by both the leaders of Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that has seen a strengthening the peace processes in that region as well as the broader region. So that has been seen as a positive move, even by the UN Secretary General. And then the
Oh,
second major area, oh, okay,
no, no, carry on.
yes, the second major nation being Afghanistan, with the US pullout in 2 years ago. Afghanistan is bankrupt and it needs a major reconstruction effort. And China has the kind of resources to help rebuild the nation. So there has been more presence of China in Afghanistan. So these are two examples of a new kind of engagement in reconstruction in a new kind of Middle East that's emerging. It is emerging and it's not yet settled, but it's an interesting process that's taking place.
Okay, we do know that Iran was funding the Yemenis in their fight with the Saudis, even though the whole world realized, or at the time was saying that this war makes no sense, as you have explained as well. We know the situation in Afghanistan, but everything you've covered this morning, what do we hope the final outcome will be regarding the all important question, and that is Palestine, because that is really at the heart of the matter as well for us as Muslims, um, not forgetting that there are also Christian Palestinian people as well.
Yes, that's very important, Julie. Remember that Palestine has always been that most intractable conflict purely because of the post-World War II, the state of Israel, the Holocaust, etc. And so because Western guilt had to rebuild the state of Israel with phenomenal resources over many decades, and so politically the West will always back the state of Israel. But there are some new thinking from the East. So Russia, China are beginning to definitely look at the Middle East and the Arab world more holistically and not just within that paradigm. And I think it's an important shift. But you must remember also with the current administration, the majority of Israeli citizens themselves are not happy with the direction of the kind of, let's say, right-wing government of Likud.
Mm.
So there could be more outreach with Israel citizens and the Middle East to get some kind of coexistence, which is important. And definitely restoring the rights of Palestinians and stopping the settlements would be the first important thing, prerequisites for peace. So China is also looking at potential peace talks in the near future, not in the immediate future. And the regional powers would lead, i.e., Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey. So we call them the Troika. They
Mm.
would be significant in trying to find a solution that's acceptable to all parties. So it's quite interesting times. And the issue is the good perspective is the Chinese model is they don't interfere directly in the political processes of countries. And that is quite refreshing for most nations because the sovereignty is then maintained. So they are there as a supporter, as an enabler, but mainly as a development and infrastructure partner to get economics going. Because remember, the real crisis in the Middle East is the high unemployment rate of the youth.
Mm.
And if that is not resolved, economic development doesn't take place in the Middle East. With gender being a major issue, you don't get women in the workplace. The poverty levels in the Middle East is quite high. The Human Development Index is quite low. And you need economic development and jobs. Because if there's no jobs, a large portion of the youth can get into extremist politics. So this is the big kind of new development push that's required in the region.
I really have to squeeze in one or two questions before I let you go, but let's keep try and keep it short and sharp. When we look at the Palestinian situation, do you think that they'll ever come to the two-state solution? Is that workable? Will that be acceptable to both the Palestinians and the Israeli occupiers? Question number one. Question number two, you spoke about something very important, and that is the high unemployment rate in the Middle East. If that is not addressed, as you indicated, there's going to be huge problems, possibly another Arab Spring. Um, but added to that, we understand that the Indian government and Israelis have signed a deal to bring in over 100,000 Indian laborers into Israel. That's going to put all of those Palestinians out of work. And that is going to really be disastrous, is it not?
Look, the geopolitics is very complicated. Unfortunately, India under the Modi government in the last decade has shifted towards a pro-Israel position.
Mm.
But they're also paying the price because they're being marginalized in the broader Middle East region outside Israel. And whether that works for them is still early to say. But what we can decisively say that yes, without jobs, it's just going to mean more antagonism and more conflict. Whereas the situation needs a kind of coexistence. There may be a coexistence almost within the next decade or so, as Israel society realizes that the demographics is just not in their favor and they would have to settle for a one state, democratic state solution. And
One,
that would then, yeah, that means
one
all
state, not two state.
yeah, one, I believe the one state, a unitary state like South Africa. That is the
Okay.
ideal situation.
Hmm.
And it means that everybody lives under, like South Africa, one constitution, human rights are protected,
Right.
etc. But the right wing is very powerful in Israeli politics, and they are the bloc in terms of realizing a unitary kind of state that's democratic and that could be a beacon for kind of coexistence.
Ashraf Patel, Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Thank you indeed for your deep insights into all of these geopolitical issues in the Middle East. Um, Lovely talking with you. Till the next time. Salaam alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, Julie. Shukran.
8:51 news and views on Salam Media. We're going for a We're going for an ad break, and inshallah, when we get back, we will be joined by our next guest. And this is a very sad community story. Amina Dawood and George Costa will be joining us. They're from Morningside in Durban. They are both Ward 27 residents. I presume they are both Ward 27 residents. So please stand by for that interview as well.